Texas, spring of 1945. The sun climbed over endless flatlands, painting shadows across barbed wire and wooden watchtowers at Camp Hearn. Heat already shimmered off the mess hall roof. 14 German women stood in a loose line near the corral fence, hands clasped, eyes adjusting to light so bright it felt physical. They had been told Americans were brutal. They had rehearsed defiance, prepared for humiliation. Instead, a ranch hand named Tom walked toward them carrying saddles. Rope coiled over his shoulder, dust on his boots. "What are those for?" one whispered in German. No one answered. None of them could have imagined. The war in Europe was collapsing. Berlin smoldered. Hamburg lay in ruins. And in the chaos of surrender, among the millions streaming across devastated landscapes, came a group most Americans never expected to see. German women in Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, captured by Allied forces and designated as prisoners of war. They were Helferinnen, military auxiliaries, communications specialists, clerks, translators, medical assistants, young women who had served in uniform, who wore the eagle and swastika, who followed orders in a regime that told them they were building a 1,000-year empire. Now they stood on foreign soil, defeated, uncertain, waiting. The train carrying them southwest rattled through Kansas in late April. Through the windows, the landscape transformed. Gone were the bombed cities, the skeletal factories, the hunger-etched faces of occupied Europe. Here stretched endless plains dotted with cattle, farmhouses painted white, grain silos catching afternoon light. Children waved from dusty roads. Women hung laundry in backyards. The normalcy felt surreal. Ingrid Hoffmann pressed her forehead against the glass. 23 years old, from Hamburg, daughter of a shipyard worker. She had spent 2 years as a radio operator for the Luftwaffe Communications Division in France. The last thing she remembered before capture was running through a burning airfield outside Lyon, smoke so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Now she watched American farmland scroll past like scenes from a propaganda film she would have dismissed as impossible. The other women sat silent, swaying with the train's rhythm. Some dozed, others stared at their hands. They wore the gray-green wool uniforms issued months ago, now stained, torn at the elbows, missing buttons. Their faces carried the hollow look of people who had stopped expecting good news. Beside Ingrid sat Margareta Schneider, 31, a nurse from Munich who had worked field hospitals on the Eastern Front. Her hands moved constantly, restless, as if searching for bandages to change or wounds to dress. Across from them, Elsa Werner, 19, from a village outside Dresden, a clerk who typed orders she never questioned until the day Soviet artillery began falling and questioning became irrelevant. The train slowed. Through the windows, Texas appeared. Not the Texas of their imagination, if they had imagined it at all, but something stranger, more vast. Sky pressed down like blue glass. Mesquite trees twisted low against red earth. Cattle moved slow as clouds. The horizon swallowed fear and replaced it with vertigo. They disembarked at a small station south of San Antonio. Heat hit like a physical force. The air tasted of dust and something sweet. Hay or wildflowers, Ingrid couldn't tell. American soldiers stood nearby, rifles loose in their hands, talking quietly among themselves. They looked young. Farm boys in olive drab. One chewed gum, another squinted at a newspaper. An officer approached. Captain James Morrison, 46, from East Texas, son of ranchers, a man whose face showed sun damage and something else, weariness maybe, or resignation. He spoke in accented German, words slow and careful. "You will be taken to Camp Hearn. You will work. You will follow regulations. You will not be harmed." The women exchanged glances. Not be harmed. The phrase hung strange in the heat. What did that mean? What did Americans consider harm? From there, they were placed on trucks. Canvas flapped overhead as they drove north through ranch country. Ingrid watched Texas unfold, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality. She had been told Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here stretched land that looked hard-won, maintained by labor she could see in every fence post, every irrigation line, every carefully tended field. They passed through small towns where people stopped to stare. An old woman on a porch, hand shading her eyes. A boy on a bicycle, mouth open. A shopkeeper sweeping his step, broom going still. No one shouted. No one threw stones. They simply watched, faces unreadable, as the trucks carried German prisoners deeper into Texas. Camp Hearn sat 30 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by rangeland that rolled gentle toward distant mesas. Established in 1943 to hold Italian and German POWs, it consisted of barracks arranged in neat rows, a mess hall, guard towers at each corner, and beyond the wire, corrals where horses moved like ink brushstrokes against evening light. The women's barracks occupied the south section, separate from the male POW compounds. Inside, rows of cots with thin mattresses, footlockers, a single window facing west. The walls were unpainted pine that smelled of resin in the heat. Someone had left folded blankets on each bed. Someone had swept the floor clean. That first night they lay awake listening. Crickets, wind through mesquite, distant cattle lowing. Sounds that belonged to peace, not war. Ingrid stared at shadows on the ceiling and thought about her mother, her younger brother, the apartment in Hamburg that might not exist anymore. Her throat tightened. She turned toward the wall. Morning came sudden and bright. A guard knocked on the barracks door at dawn, voice gruff but not cruel. Breakfast in 20 minutes. Then work assignments. They dressed quickly, fingers clumsy with fatigue. Outside, the sky showed pink and orange, colors Ingrid associated with childhood, with mornings before the war when her father still lived and Hamburg still stood intact. The air smelled different here, dry and clean, without the overlay of rubble dust and smoke that had become Europe's perfume. The mess hall surprised them first. Long tables covered with checked cloth, metal trays stacked beside serving stations, and the food. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee so strong the smell made Ingrid's stomach clench with sudden hunger. Fresh milk in pitchers, butter, real butter, yellow and soft. Margaret stopped walking. Her eyes filled. "Is this real?" An American guard, young, maybe 20, grinned. "Plenty more where that came from. Y'all ain't starving on my watch." They sat together, uncertain, picking up forks with hands that trembled. The first bite of bacon tasted like revelation. Salt and fat and smoke, textures they had almost forgotten. Ingrid ate slowly, afraid she might cry, afraid this might be theater designed to soften them before harsher treatment began. But the guard just poured more coffee, whistling something tuneless, and wandered back to the kitchen. After breakfast, work assignments. The camp commander, Colonel William Hayes, stood before them in the morning light. 50s, silver hair, face that suggested he had spent more time on horseback than behind desks. He spoke in English, with an interpreter translating. "You folks will be helping with ranch operations, feeding livestock, cleaning stables, mending fences, riding when necessary. We're short-handed. The boys are overseas. You'll work 6 days, rest on Sunday, treat the animals right, treat each other right. We'll have no problems." "Riding?" Elsa whispered to Ingrid. "We're prisoners." The interpreter, a thin man named Garcia who spoke German with a Spanish accent, heard her. "Horses don't care about politics, señorita. They just need feeding." The first day in the corrals felt like stepping into someone else's dream. The women were divided into groups and led to different sections of the ranch operation. Ingrid found herself assigned to the main stable, a long building that smelled of hay and leather, and something mineral, horse sweat maybe, or the dust that rose from their coats. Tom Brennan ran the stables. 58, born on the ranch his grandfather homesteaded in 1872, a man whose hands showed decades of rope work, and whose eyes held the patient skepticism of someone who trusted horses more than humans. He sized up the German women with a long look, then nodded. "Can any of you ride?" Silence. Then Margaret raised her hand tentatively. "I rode as a child, before the war." Tom handed her a curry brush. "Start with grooming. The mare in the third stall, gentle as Sunday. Talk to her while you work." Margaret approached the stall. The mare, a bay with white socks, turned her head and exhaled through velvet nostrils. For the first time since capture, Margaret smiled. She lifted the brush and began working it through the mare's coat in long, steady strokes, murmuring in German nonsense words, the kind of soft sounds that cross language barriers. The mare leaned into the touch. Tom watched from the doorway, arms crossed. After a moment, he called to another prisoner. "You there, Elsa, right? Come help me with the feed." The work was physical, exhausting, honest. They hauled hay bales, filled water troughs, mucked stalls, mended tack. Sweat soaked through their uniforms. Their backs ached. Blisters formed on hands unused to this labor. But something shifted. The simplicity of caring for animals, the rhythm of routine, the absence of sirens and explosions and constant fear, it created space for something they had lost. Presence. By midday, the heat shimmered like glass over the corrals. The women took breaks in the shade of the barn, drinking water from tin cups, too tired to talk. Tom brought sandwiches, thick slices of beef between fresh bread, and handed them out without comment. Ingrid bit into hers and tasted something beyond food. Generosity, maybe. Or the kind of practical compassion that exists in places where survival depends on everyone doing their part. That evening, after the day's work ended, they returned to the barracks exhausted. Ingrid's hands throbbed. Her shoulders felt like stone. She lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what felt like cognitive dissonance. In Germany, she had been told Americans were the enemy, weak, materialistic, lacking discipline and moral fiber. Yet here, in this place, she had encountered something different. Routine, structure, fairness, food, and strangers who treated her not as subhuman, but as someone capable of work and deserving of rest afterward. Margaret sat on the edge of her cot, unlacing her boots. "That mare," she said quietly. "She reminded me of my childhood. Before everything." Ingrid closed her eyes. Before everything. Before the war, the bombing, the propaganda, the collapse. Before the moment when the world they knew disintegrated and left them here, in Texas, grooming horses for people they were supposed to hate. Weeks passed. Spring gave way to early summer. The work continued day after day in heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The women grew stronger, muscles adapting, skin darkening from sun. They learned the rhythms of the ranch, when to feed, when to water, which horses preferred gentle handling, and which responded to firmness. Tom began teaching them to ride properly, not just sitting on a horse, but understanding the animal beneath them, the language of weight and pressure and trust. Margaret proved a natural. She moved with the mare as if they shared thoughts, anticipating each step, each turn. Tom nodded approval. "You've got the gift. Not everyone does." She ducked her head, embarrassed by praise. But something in her posture changed, straightened. The American guards proved different from expectations. Most were young men deemed unfit for combat duty, farm boys with flat feet, or poor eyesight, or minor heart murmurs. Men who would have preferred to be overseas fighting, but instead found themselves watching over prisoners in Texas. They approached their duty with a mixture of boredom and curiosity. One guard, Private Danny Foster, 20, from Oklahoma, struck up tentative conversations with the women during water breaks. His German consisted of maybe 15 words, their English only slightly better, but they managed a pidgin communication that involved hand gestures and patient repetition. "You miss home?" he asked Ingrid one afternoon, leaning against the corral fence. She nodded. "Always. Me too." Denny kicked at the dirt. "My mama makes the best peach pie. You got pie in Germany?" "Before the war, yes." They stood together in companionable silence, watching horses graze in the distance. The absurdity of the moment, enemy soldiers sharing homesickness, went unspoken, but felt. By midsummer, small gestures of kindness accumulated. Tom brought extra apples for the horses and let the women feed them from their palms, laughing when the velvet noses tickled. The mess hall cook, a Mexican-American woman named Rosa, started saving fresh tortillas for them, teaching them to fold the warm rounds around scrambled eggs and beans. The camp chaplain, Father Mackenzie, offered to mail letters home if they wanted to write, though he couldn't guarantee delivery with Europe in chaos. Elsa wrote to her mother in what remained of Dresden. The letter took her 3 days to compose, words inadequate for the strangeness of her situation. She described the horses, the heat, the food. She left out the confusion of being treated with decency by people she had been taught to despise. At night, in the barracks, the women talked quietly. They shared stories from before the war, carefully avoiding politics, finding common ground in childhood memories, in lost families, in the universal language of grief and uncertainty. Ingrid learned that Margaret had wanted to be a veterinarian before the regime closed universities to women who wouldn't commit to the party. That Elsa had loved American jazz music in secret, listening to forbidden radio broadcasts. That most of them had joined the auxiliaries not from ideological fervor, but from limited options, from family pressure, from the simple need to survive in a system that punished non-participation. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were young women who had made choices in impossible circumstances, who carried guilt and shame and relief in equal measure, who now found themselves in a place that made no sense according to everything they had been told. The moment that broke something fundamental happened on a Saturday morning in July. The air hung thick with approaching rain, clouds building on the western horizon like gray fortresses. Tom had taken several women, including Ingrid and Margaret, to a far pasture to check on a mare due to foal. They rode in silence, the horses moving steady beneath them. Ingrid had grown comfortable in the saddle, body learning to move with the animal's rhythm, hands light on the reins. The landscape rolled away in every direction, endless grass punctuated by mesquite and occasional live oaks. Hawks circled high overhead, wings dark against building clouds. They found the mare in distress. She stood near a stock tank, sides heaving, eyes rolling white. Tom dismounted fast, handed his reins to Elsa, approached slow and calm, speaking low. "Easy, girl. Easy now." The mare stamped, nervous. Tom examined her carefully, then swore under his breath. "Foal's breech. She needs help or we'll lose them both." Margaret slid from her horse without thinking. "I've delivered foals and calves before I became a nurse." Tom looked at her, measuring, then nodded. "All right. What do you need?" They worked together in the rising wind. Margaret stripped to her shirt sleeves, arms bare, and helped Tom guide the foal into proper position. The mare groaned, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Rain began falling, fat drops that raised dust before soaking into the ground. Ingrid and Elsa held the horses, watching Margareta work with practiced hands, murmuring in German to the laboring mare, gentling her through contractions. Tom followed Margareta's directions, two people united in the immediate urgency of saving lives, nationality irrelevant in the face of biology and need. The foal came in a rush of fluid and membrane. Margaret cleared its nose and mouth while Tom helped the mare to her feet. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the foal gasped, shuddered, opened dark eyes to Texas rain. Margaret sat back on her heels, arms covered to the elbows in blood and birth matter, face streaming with rain and tears. Tom gripped her shoulder. "Good work. Damn good work." She looked up at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, the dissolution of propaganda in the face of shared humanity. They rode back to camp as the storm broke fully, rain hammering down in sheets, lightning splitting the sky. Ingrid felt something shift inside her chest, some tightly held belief about the world cracking open. She had watched two people, American and German, enemy and enemy, work together to save a life. She had seen Margaret treated not as a prisoner, not as the enemy, but as someone with skill and knowledge and value. That evening, Tom brought them all to the stable to see the foal nursing. It stood on wobbly legs, tail switching, the mare nuzzling it with infinite gentleness. The women gathered around the stall in wet clothes, saying nothing, just watching new life in the gathering dusk. Later, Margaret wrote in a diary the chaplain had given her. Her handwriting showed exhaustion, but the words carried something else. "Today I delivered a foal on American soil with an American rancher who called me by my name and trusted my knowledge. I do not know what this means for everything I believed. I only know the foal lived and the mare lived, and I felt for the first time since the war began, useful for something other than destruction. News from Europe arrived in fragments. The war had ended in May, but the scope of what came after, the revelations, emerged slowly. The camp received newspapers, radio broadcasts, official reports, and the women learned what had been done in their name. The camps, the systematic murder, the industrial scale of atrocity. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka, names that would become synonyms for evil. Some women refused to believe it. Propaganda, they insisted. Exaggeration. But the photographs came, the testimonies, the evidence too vast to dismiss, and something inside them collapsed. Ingrid sat in the barracks with a newspaper in her lap, staring at images of skeletal prisoners, of mass graves, of horror that exceeded imagination. Her hands trembled. Beside her, Elsa wept silently, shoulders shaking. "We didn't know," Elsa whispered. "We didn't know." But they had known something. They had seen Jews disappear from their neighborhoods, had watched synagogues burn, had heard whispers and rumors they chose not to pursue. They had participated in a system that required their blindness to function. The weight of it settled like physical mass, guilt, shame, the terrible recognition that they had been part of something monstrous, even in small ways, even in auxiliary roles, even in simple compliance. Father Mackenzie found Ingrid sitting alone in the stable one evening, face in her hands. He sat beside her on a hay bale, saying nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weariness of someone who had heard many confessions. "You cannot change what was done. You can only decide who you will be going forward." Ingrid looked at him, eyes red. "How do we live with this? The same way everyone else does. One day at a time, with work, with honesty, with attempts at goodness, even knowing we'll fail often." The conversation offered no comfort, only the cold truth that redemption, if it existed at all, would require lifetimes they hadn't been promised. Work became refuge. The women threw themselves into ranch duties with renewed intensity, as if physical exhaustion might quiet internal accusations. They stayed late at the stables, volunteering for extra shifts, finding in the care of animals something uncomplicated, something that didn't require them to reconcile the irreconcilable. Tom noticed but said nothing. He simply made sure they had enough work, enough water, enough small responsibilities to anchor them to the present moment. The horses asked nothing about the past. They only required presence, attention, gentle hands, and steady voices. In that simplicity, the women found something like survival. As summer deepened, the heat became something to endure rather than notice. Days blurred together in routines that slowly rebuilt their sense of self. Work, meals, rest, small conversations with guards who increasingly treated them as individuals rather than categories. One afternoon, Danny brought his guitar to the corral and played while the women worked nearby. Simple folk songs, melodies that crossed language barriers. Ingrid found herself humming along, the first time she had made music since before the war. "You know this one?" Danny asked, strumming something slow and sad. "The tune is different, but we have something similar, about leaving home." "Sing it." She hesitated, then did, voice cracking at first, then finding strength. The German lyrics merged with Danny's guitar, and for a few minutes the war felt distant, irrelevant, a nightmare they had collectively woken from. Other prisoners gathered to listen. American soldiers leaned against fence posts. The moment held strange peace. Enemy soldiers united in the universal longing for home and the universal beauty of music that transcends politics. Tom organized a small celebration for the 4th of July. Nothing elaborate, just extra food at supper, watermelon chilled in the spring house, ice cream churned by hand. He invited the women to join, uncertain how they would react to American patriotic observance. They came tentatively, sat at the long tables, ate watermelon and spit seeds into the dust, watched fireworks launched from the far side of the camp, bright flowers blooming in the dark sky. Margaret sat beside Tom, both of them quiet. When the last firework faded, she spoke. Thank you for treating us like people. Tom looked at her, face shadowed. Can't see the point in anything else. Simple words that carried the weight of philosophy. In a world that had been defined by dehumanization, by reduction of humans to categories and categories to acceptable targets, one rancher in Texas chose a different approach. Not from ideology or grand moral vision, but from the practical understanding that cruelty served no purpose and kindness cost nothing. That night, Ingrid lay awake thinking about transformation. Not dramatic, not sudden, but the slow accumulation of moments that reshaped understanding. The bacon on the first morning, the mare nuzzling her foal, Tom's hand on Margaretta's shoulder, Danny's guitar in the evening light, small kindnesses that undermined everything propaganda had built. She realized she was no longer afraid. Not of Americans, not of guards, not of what came next. Fear had been replaced by something more complex, less comfortable. Uncertainty, yes, but also possibility. The recognition that the world contained more nuance than ideology allowed, more humanity than war revealed. By August, mail service to Europe had been partially restored. The women wrote letters, careful, censored, but honest within limits. They described the ranch, the horses, the heat. They asked about family, about neighborhoods, about whether home still existed in any recognizable form. Responses came slowly, sporadically. Some letters arrived with entire paragraphs blacked out by military censors. Others described devastation so complete it felt abstract, beyond comprehension. Hamburg gone, Dresden rubble. Entire cities erased or transformed beyond recognition. Ingrid received a letter from her aunt in October. Her mother had survived the bombing but died of pneumonia the following winter. Her brother was missing, probably captured by Soviets, location unknown. The apartment had burned. Everything was gone. She read the letter 3 times, sitting on her cot, while evening shadows stretched across the barracks floor. Grief arrived not as dramatic collapse, but as hollow recognition. She had been orphaned by war, as millions had been orphaned. Another statistic in an ocean of loss. That evening, she walked to the corral alone. The horses grazed peacefully in the last light, their movements slow and rhythmic. She leaned against the fence and let herself cry, finally, for everything lost, everything that could never be recovered. Tom found her there. He didn't speak, just stood nearby, giving her space and presence in equal measure. After a long while, he offered a handkerchief, clean and pressed, the gesture so ordinary it almost broke her again. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded. "My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer. Some losses, you carry them forever. But carrying gets easier." They stood together, watching darkness settle over the ranch. 2 people united by grief, by the universal experience of survival when others had not survived, by the strange intimacy of shared silence. Fall arrived, temperatures cooled. The endless summer heat gave way to mornings that required jackets and evenings where breath showed white in lamplight. The women had been at Camp Hearn 6 months, time enough to reshape understanding, time enough to build routines that felt like life rather than captivity. Then came the announcement. Repatriation would begin in the new year. German POWs would be returned to Europe, to occupied zones, to whatever remained of their homeland. The women received the news in silence. Return. The word should have sparked joy, relief, the promise of reunion. Instead, it felt complicated. Return to what? To rubble and famine and collective guilt? To a country that had been divided by victors, a society that would spend generations processing its shame? Here they had food, work, purpose. Here they had been treated with unexpected decency. Here they had learned to ride horses and deliver foals and speak broken English with guards who brought them cold watermelon in July. Leaving meant stepping back into uncertainty, into devastation, into a world that would view them with suspicion or worse. Margaret sat on her cot that night, staring at her hands. These hands had treated wounds at field hospitals, had delivered a foal in a rainstorm, had learned to braid a horse's mane with patient care. What would they do in Germany? Where would she fit in a country that needed rebuilding from ashes? "I don't know if I can go back," she told Ingrid. I don't know what's there for me. Ingrid understood. She too felt caught between worlds. The Germany of her childhood no longer existed. The person she had been before the war had dissolved in the crucible of everything after. Who returned? What version of herself would step off the ship in Hamburg, assuming Hamburg had docks left standing? Tom noticed their subdued mood. One afternoon, while they worked together cleaning tack, he asked directly, "You afraid to go home?" Margaret paused, leather cleaner in hand. "Home doesn't exist anymore. We're going back to a place that has the same name but nothing else familiar." He nodded slowly. War does that. Takes the world you knew and replaces it with something else. My father fought in the First War. He told me he came home to a place that looked the same but felt foreign. Said it took years before he felt like he belonged anywhere. Did it get better? Eventually. He learned to build something new, rather than mourn what was gone. Simple advice, hard-won wisdom from someone who understood loss. Margaret returned to cleaning the bridle, working saddle soap into leather with steady circles, focusing on the immediate task because the future felt too vast to contemplate. Winter brought a different beauty to the ranch. Frost on fence posts, breath visible in morning light. Horses grew thick winter coats and the women learned to blanket them at night, to check for ice in water troughs, to adjust routines for shorter days. Christmas approached. Father Mackenzie organized a simple service in the mess hall. He invited everyone, guards and prisoners alike, to gather for hymns and prayer. The women attended tentatively, uncertain of their place in American religious observance. But the carols were familiar. Silent Night had been written in Austria. The melodies crossed borders. Ingrid found herself singing in German, while American soldiers sang in English. The same words, the same longing for peace, unified in momentary transcendence of nationality. Afterward, Rosa served hot chocolate and cookies, simple pleasures that felt profound. Margaret sat with Tom, both of them warming their hands on ceramic mugs, talking about horses and weather and nothing consequential. The ordinariness of it, the normalcy, felt like grace. "You'll do well when you go back," Tom said quietly. "You've got strength. You'll rebuild." She smiled, sad and grateful. "Because of here. Because of what I learned here about who I could be." In January, the first group of prisoners received departure dates. The women packed their few belongings, the small treasures accumulated over months, a smooth stone from the creek, dried wildflowers pressed between pages of a donated book, photographs Tom had taken of them with the horses, black and white images that captured a strange interlude in history. On the final morning, the women gathered at the stable to say goodbye to the horses. Margaret spent a long time with the bay mare, forehead pressed to the animal's neck, whispering thanks in German. The mare stood patient, accepting the affection with calm presence. Tom shook each woman's hand. His grip was firm, his eyes direct. "You take care now. Remember what you learned here. About the work, about people, about moving forward." Ingrid nodded, throat tight. She wanted to thank him for everything, for the kindness that had undermined her certainty, for treating them with dignity when he could have chosen cruelty, for being living proof that humanity persisted even in wartime. But the words felt inadequate. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." He tipped his hat. "You earned your keep. The horses will miss you." They loaded onto trucks in the pale winter light. As Camp Hearn receded behind them, Ingrid looked back one final time. The corrals, the stable, the barracks that had been home for 8 months, the landscape that had witnessed transformation she was still trying to understand. The ship carrying them back to Europe departed from New York in late January. The crossing took 12 days through winter seas. The women stood at the rail watching America disappear into gray distance, each carrying private thoughts about what Texas had meant, what they had learned, who they had become. They arrived in Bremen to find a city that existed more in memory than reality. 90% destroyed, rubble mountains where neighborhoods had stood, survivors moving through ruins like ghosts, faces hollow with hunger and exhaustion. Ingrid made her way to Hamburg by train. or what passed for train service in occupied Germany. Freight cars packed with refugees and displaced persons, all searching for something or someone lost to war. She found her aunt living in the basement of a bombed-out building, surviving on Allied food rations and work-clearing rubble. The reunion was quiet. They had nothing left but each other. But Ingrid carried something with her from Texas. The memory of being treated with decency when she deserved none. The knowledge that enemies could become complicated, that humanity persisted in unexpected places, that small acts of kindness undermined propaganda more effectively than any counter-argument. She found work helping to rebuild, physical labor, not unlike ranch work, hauling debris, mixing concrete. Her hands, calloused from Texas corrals, adapted quickly. At night, she remembered horses moving across endless sky, remembered watermelon on the 4th of July, remembered a rancher who chose kindness over convenience. Margaret settled in Munich, which had suffered less devastation than many cities. She found work at a veterinary clinic, her experience with animals overcoming questions about her war service. Eventually, she married a farmer, moved to a small village, raised children, who grew up hearing stories about horses in Texas, about Americans who treated enemy prisoners like human beings, about a war that taught hard lessons about propaganda and truth. Elsa returned to Dresden, or what remained of it. She worked as a translator for American occupation forces, her English learned at Camp Herne, proving useful in the new order. She never married. She spent her life teaching children languages, believing that communication across borders was the antidote to the ideology that had destroyed her generation. In the decades that followed, historians would puzzle over the phenomenon of German POWs in America. More than 400,000 prisoners, held far from combat, treated according to Geneva Convention standards that often exceeded conditions for American citizens. Fed well, paid for labor, allowed recreation and education. Some prisoners reported that their years in American camps were the best of their lives, a statement that revealed as much about the brutality of the Eastern Front as it did about American treatment. The women prisoners remained largely invisible in official histories, too few to warrant detailed study, too complicated to fit neat narratives about gender and war. But they existed. These women who wore Wehrmacht gray and worked American ranches, who learned that enemies were more complex than propaganda allowed, who carried home memories of unexpected kindness that shaped their understanding of humanity forever after.